Hello guys and welcome as always to Let's Talk About It. On today's episode we're going to be talking about life and death in ancient Egypt. So, if you were born into an ancient Egyptian society, your place within the social hierarchy and the working roles within that were pretty much laid out. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the servants and the slaves, who were made up primarily of prisoners of war from successful Egyptian conquests. Unlike what you would associate with the modern meaning of the word slave, these people actually had more rights and freedoms than you may imagine. Above them was the peasant community, which made up the vast majority of the population. Generally, these people worked as highly skilled farmers or labourers, which was a very difficult task, and contrary to popular belief that the slaves took on this task, it was actually the peasants that built the pyramids. Closer to the top of the social ladder were the middle classes, which was made up primarily of scribes, military officers, architects and priests, and as you would imagine, these people were afforded more luxuries and wealth than people below them. And then at the top of the ladder was the royal family, and the royal family was headed up by a pharaoh. The pharaoh was the chosen intermediary of the gods and basically acted as an avatar, meaning the pharaoh was responsible for keeping religious harmony and for also controlling his kingdom. But of course, above the pharaoh were the gods. Because, as I'm sure you are aware, the ancient Egyptians' lives revolved heavily around the gods, who they believed, in one way or another, controlled everything. And much like the River Nile, they believed that gods could give life and take it away. For example, Khonsu was the god of the moon and was known for healing. But he had a tendency to eat human hearts, and on occasion, when he felt cannibalistic, eating other gods themselves. There was also the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, who was responsible for the spreading or the control of diseases and pestilence and plague, giving her the name Lady of Terror. And there was also Ati, a goddess of whom very little is known. She had the body of a hippo, depicting fear and disorder, and also the head of a wasp, a creature with a bad reputation even today. It is thought that, with those combination of animals, that Ati was a spiteful, vengeful and cruel goddess. Now, while social status was very important in ancient Egyptian society, so too was family. And the more children a couple could have, the more secure they could feel in their later life, which led to the ancient Egyptians having the highest birth rate in the ancient world. However, despite wanting large families, wanting that large support network around them, the ancient Egyptians actually had birth control. Their version of birth control came in the form of a vaginal plug that was made of crocodile dung, sow milk and honey. It wouldn't be unreasonable to think that they used this disgusting mix as a way to just put people off having sex. However, there is evidence to suggest that crocodile dung actually acts as a spermicide. So, whilst life in ancient Egypt may not be as bad or oppressive as you might first think, although compared to modern standards it's clearly nowhere near as good, life in general still came with many problems. For example, living in an extremely sandy environment caused a number of health issues. Sand particles would get into the Egyptians' eyes, causing severe infections. And it also contributed to ancient Egyptians' terrible teeth due to sand getting into their food. As with any society, crime was also an issue. But with jails not really existing, the ancient Egyptians saw them as a waste of time. Why have somebody locked up in a cage where they could be working? Punishments for breaking the law would be swift and brutal. For example, receiving 100 lashes or being stabbed or gouged with a spear in a way that meant you could keep on working were commonplace. And then there is a legend of a place called Rhinocolura. This was a place that criminals would be exiled to, and once there, they would have their nose amputated. The reason for this was twofold. Firstly, it distinguished criminals from non-criminals, and secondly, the ancient Egyptians believed that when entering the afterlife, your body needed to be entirely intact. Removing the nose simply furthered the criminal's punishment. And then there was the problem of hippopotamus. These large beasts were a constant worry for people working on or near the Nile due to the animal's aggressive nature and willingness to attack. In fact, it is believed by many that King Tut was in fact killed by a hippopotamus due to injuries found on his body. But of course, hippo attacks weren't the only cause of deaths for people in ancient Egypt. For example, people would die from diseases such as tuberculosis or smallpox, with the latter having wiped out thousands as it plagued the people. Being infected by parasitic worms was also a common cause of death, as was heart disease, due to ancient Egyptians' terrible diet, which saw many people die during the days of the pharaohs. But of course, ancient Egyptians would often meet their end at the hands of ancient Egyptians. Whilst they believed strongly in the sanctity of life, there were some crimes that could only be punishable by death. Prisoners of war, if not being turned into slaves, would be beheaded, impaled on giant spikes, or burnt alive. And the burning of people alive seemed to be a very popular method of execution in ancient Egypt, because it was the same death sentence handed out to children who had murdered their parents, or to anybody that had offended the sun god Ra, with those people's deaths becoming a human sacrifice, which was actually a very rare practice in ancient Egypt. The burning of the body firstly caused great pain, but also meant that the dead had no vessel in the afterlife, which for the time was a truly terrifying prospect. But of course, death by execution or murder wasn't just for slaves, peasants and the middle classes. Pharaohs and royal family members also suffered the same fate. For example, Ramesses III was the victim of the harem conspiracy, which saw one of his wives, Tai, slit his throat and cut off his toe. Her reason for doing this was to make way for her son to become the new pharaoh. A plot which was successful in seeing Ramesses III die, but her son was never placed on the throne. And then there was the ruthless pharaoh Akhenaten, who sentenced his own daughter to death after an argument. And if that wasn't cruel enough, he also severed one of her hands, because, as with the prisoners that lost their noses and the bodies that were burnt, it meant she could not enter the afterlife. Now, for the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, because they believed strongly in reincarnation. They believed that after death, a person's second self, known as the Ka, would be released from the body to enjoy eternal life. But only if, as I've said many times already, the body was fully intact. And so, to preserve the dead, they would be mummified. All of the internal organs would be removed, apart from the heart. Their body would be wrapped in charm-woven, resin-soaked linen, and they would have a scarab heart amulet placed upon them, which were all important for them navigating the afterlife. However, the process of mummification was long and expensive, and was typically reserved for the rich and important, with everyone else being buried in graves out in the desert. The ancient Egyptians' belief in reincarnation is also said to be why they built the pyramids. They acted as a stairway to heaven or to the gods, as a symbol of the dead pharaoh's importance, and to hold all of the important things that the pharaoh would need in the afterlife. In the very early days of ancient Egypt, this also included slaves and servants who would be buried alive with their dead pharaoh. But this terrifying practice soon stopped, and instead the dead pharaoh would be buried with 100 cast statues of Mushabti and Shupti, who would be there to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. But of course, nothing was ever simple in ancient Egypt, and navigating the afterlife was no exception. And so they used a 78-foot papyrus scroll, known as the Book of the Dead, to guide them to reaching immortality. The Book of the Dead was written by a scribe named Ani, who lived in 13th century BCE. The story depicts Ani's journey in successfully navigating the passage to the afterlife, during which he is faced with many trials and tribulations, and of course, faces many gods. Well guys, that brings me to the end of another video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Otherwise, leave your comments below. I'd love to chat to you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.